Blanket training locomotives. Train of unfortunate events. Trauma pay ranting by raging and beating. Life is a blur when you're in shock. Keep in mind, I'm going to teach you a lesson you won't forget. I'm going to knock you into next week. How would you like me to knock your teeth down your throat? You're lucky you weren't raised in my parents' home. They would just kick your butt until you figured it out. Wait. Is hit abuse? What does child abuse look like? What does child abuse look like when it persists into the child's adult years? Punishing for existing, whipping and beating the innocent, conspiring, framing, grooming, defaming, false reporting, fraud, identity theft, wrongful imprisonment, blanket statements, lies ending lives and covering cold-hearted deeds, psychological trauma, mental trauma, psychotrauma, or psychiatric trauma, is an emotional response caused by severe distressing events such as accidents, violence, rape, terror, or sensory overload. Short-term reactions such as psychological shock and psychological denial are typically followed. Long-term reactions and effects include bipolar disorder, uncontrollable flashbacks, panic attacks, insomnia, nightmare disorder, difficulties with interpersonal relationships, and post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Physical symptoms including migraines, hyperventilation, hyperhidrosis, and nausea are often developed. 1. Trauma is not the same as mental distress or suffering, both of which are universal human experiences. 2. Unreliable source. As subjective experiences differ between individuals, people react to similar events differently. Not everyone who experiences a potentially traumatic event becomes psychologically traumatized, though they may be distressed and experience suffering. 3. Some will develop PTSD after exposure to a traumatic event or series of events. 4. 5. This discrepancy in risk rate can be attributed to protective factors some individuals have that enable them to cope with difficult events, including temperamental and environmental factors, such as resilience and willingness to seek help. 6. Blanket training, also known as blanket time, is a method adapted from the methods encouraged in To Train Up a Child, published in 1994 and written by Christian fundamentalists Michael and Debbie Pearl. To Train Up a Child promotes several harsh parenting techniques, with a focus on child obedience, which have been linked to multiple child deaths. 1. 2. Blanket training is an allocated amount of time during the day, where an infant or toddler is required to remain on a blanket or play mat for a limited period of time, with a few selected toys. When the child moves to leave the blanket, parents are instructed to hit the child with a flexible ruler, glue stick, or another similar object. 3. Many of those doing it have voiced online that they start by doing 5 minutes a day and build up the intervals over time, with some extending it to 30 minutes or more. Proponents of the technique claim that blanket training helps very young children to learn self-control. However, no empirical evidence currently exists to back these claims. Blanket statement. A faulty generalization is an informal fallacy wherein a conclusion is drawn about all or many instances of a phenomenon on the basis of one or a few instances of that phenomenon. It is similar to a proof by example in mathematics. 1. It is an example of jumping to conclusions. 2. For example, one may generalize about all people or all members of a group based on what one knows about just one or a few people. If one meets a rude person from a given country X, one may suspect that most people in country X are rude. If one sees only white swans, one may suspect that all swans are white. Expressed in more precise philosophical language, a fallacy of defective induction is a conclusion that has been made on the basis of weak premises, or one which is not justified by sufficient or unbiased evidence. 3. Unlike fallacies of relevance, in fallacies of defective induction, the premises are related to the conclusions, yet only weakly buttress the conclusions, hence a faulty generalization is produced. The essence of this inductive fallacy lies on the overestimation of an argument based on insufficiently large samples under an implied margin or error. 2. Logic edit. A faulty generalization often follows the following format. The proportion Q of the sample has attribute A, therefore, the proportion Q of the population has attribute A. Such a generalization proceeds from a premise about a sample, often unrepresentative or biased, to a conclusion about the population itself. 3. Faulty generalization is also a mode of thinking that takes the experiences of one person or one group and incorrectly extends it to another. Inductive fallacies. Edit. Hasty generalization is the fallacy of examining just one or very few examples, or studying a single case and generalizing that to be representative of the whole class of objects or phenomena. The opposite, slothful induction, is the fallacy of denying the logical conclusion of an inductive argument, dismissing an effect as just a coincidence, when it is very likely not. The overwhelming exception is related to the hasty generalization but works from the other end. It is a generalization that is accurate but tags on a qualification that eliminates enough cases as exceptions. that what remains is much less impressive than what the original statement might have led one to assume. Fallacy of unrepresentative samples is a fallacy where a conclusion is drawn using samples that are unrepresentative or biased. 4. Misleading vividness is a kind of hasty generalization that appeals to the senses. Statistical special pleading occurs when the interpretation of the relevant statistic is massaged by looking for ways to reclassify or requantify data from one portion of results, but not applying the same scrutiny to other categories. 5. This can be considered a special case of the fallacy of composition, where the item under discussion is a group, and the fallacy is what can be derived from knowledge of part of the item. Hasty generalization is an informal fallacy of faulty generalization, which involves reaching an inductive generalization based on insufficient evidence. 3. Essentially making a rushed conclusion without considering all of the variables or enough evidence. In statistics, it may involve basing broad conclusions regarding a statistical survey from a small sample group that fails to sufficiently represent an entire population. 1, 6, 7. Its opposite fallacy is called slothful induction, which consists of denying a reasonable conclusion of an inductive argument. For example, it was just a coincidence. Examples. Hasty generalization usually follows the pattern: X is true for A, X is true for B, therefore, X is true for C, D, E, etc. For example, if a person travels through a town for the first time and sees 10 people, all of them children, they may erroneously conclude that there are no adult residents in the town. Alternatively, a person might look at a number line and notice that the number 1 is a square number, 3 is a prime number, 5 is a prime number, and 7 is a prime number, 9 is a square number, 11 is a prime number, and 13 is a prime number. From these observations, the person might claim that all odd numbers are either prime or square, while in reality, 15 is an example that disproves the claim. Alternative names. The fallacy is also known as black swan fallacy, illicit generalization fallacy of insufficient sample generalization from the particular leaping to a conclusion blanket statement, hasty induction, law of small numbers, unrepresentative sample, secundum quid. When referring to a generalization made from a single example, the terms fallacy of the lonely fact, 8, or the fallacy of proof by example, might be used. 9. When evidence is intentionally excluded to bias the result. The fallacy of exclusion, a form of selection bias, is said to be involved. 10. Kangaroo court. A kangaroo court is a court that ignores recognized standards of law or justice, carries little or no official standing in the territory within which it resides, and is typically convened ad hoc. 2. A kangaroo court may ignore due process and come to a predetermined conclusion. The term may also apply to a court held by a legitimate judicial authority, which intentionally disregards the court's legal or ethical obligations. Compare show trial. 3. A session of the People's Court in Nazi Germany. A kangaroo court that conducted show trials of political enemies. 1. A kangaroo court could also develop when the structure and operation of the forum result in an inferior brand of adjudication. A common example of this is when institutional disputants, repeat players, have excessive and unfair structural advantages over individual disputants, one-shot players. 4. Etymology. The term kangaroo court is often erroneously believed to have its origin from the courts of Australia's penal colonies. 5. The Oxford English Dictionary cites the first published instance of the term as from an American source, A Stray Yankee in Texas by Philip Paxton, published in 1853. 6. There are, however, earlier instances of the term, including an 1841 article in the Daily Picayune, New Orleans, that quotes another publication, the Concordia Intelligencer, reporting several lynchings instituted on charges of the kangaroo court. The Picayune article also asks what is a kangaroo court. 7. Some sources suggest that it may have been popularized during the California gold rush of 1849, to which many thousands of Australians flocked. In consequence of the Australian miners' presence, it may have come about as a description of the hastily carried out proceedings used to deal with the issue of claim-jumping miners. 5. Ostensibly, the term comes from the notion of justice proceeding by leaps, like a kangaroo. 8. In other words, jumping over, intentionally ignoring, evidence that would be in favor of the defendant. An alternative theory is that as these courts are often convened quickly to deal with an immediate issue, they are called kangaroo courts since they have jumped up out of nowhere, like a kangaroo. Another possibility is that the phrase could refer to the pouch of a kangaroo, meaning the court is in someone's pocket. 9, 10, 11. Etymologist Philologus argues that the term arose because a place named Kangaroo sounded comical to its hearers, just as place names like Kalamazoo, and Booger Hole, and Okefenokee Swamp, strike us as comical. 12. The phrase is popular in the Anglosphere and is still in common use. 13, 14. As informal proceedings in sport. The term is sometimes used without any negative connotation. For example, many Major League Baseball and minor league baseball teams have a kangaroo court to punish players for errors and other mistakes on the field, as well as for being late for a game or practice, not wearing proper attire to road games, or having a messy locker in the clubhouse. Fines are allotted, and at the end of the year, the money collected is given to charity. The organization may also use the money for a team party at the end of the season. 15.